Good morning. Today we're going to move on to the second chapter of Hosea. So go ahead and pause me and read Hosea chapter 2. Okay, this is pretty straightforward stuff. Verse 1 is actually a continuation of chapter 1. You wonder sometimes who divided this stuff up, but chapter 1 ends with the people of Judah and the people of Israel be reunited. And you will say of your brothers my people and of your sisters my loved one. That goes back to the names that Hosea and Gomer had given their children. But verse 2 starts this whole condemnation and rejection of Israel. And it's all talked about in terms of this divorce with Gomer, his wife, Hosea's wife. So, verse 2, this divorce, it's debatable whether this was legal or not. Probably there was a legal divorce. It's not sure whether the second children were hers or maybe were hers after the divorce, the second and third child. Anyway, this talks about in Jeremiah 11:10, it's the same where Israel broke the covenant. So Gomer broke the covenant. This was not something that Hosea did, just like it's not something that God did in breaking the covenant with Israel. In verse 3, stripping her naked. This is a metaphor that goes back to pulling Israel back to the time where she was a slave to Pharaoh, to the status where you're just basically nothing. And in verse 3, she also relinquishes her dowry. So she's got nothing. She is nothing. She's got nothing. In verse 4, it talks about the idolatry continuing into the next generation. In verse 5, it talks about she being Gomer going after her lovers, and Israel going after her lovers. And this word lovers is a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word original it implies sinful loves. It's not true love. And in verse 6, this hedge of thorns to keep this in. So back then they used they didn't have fences. They used hedges of thorns to keep their cattle in. So this hedge of thorns is a fence to keep idolatry from spreading. And the lovers that are mentioned are Egypt and Assyria at this point. That was in verse 5. The hedge of thorns is in verse 6. In verse 7, so she's not finding lovers after an eager, vehement pursuit. So she is really working hard to find lovers. And this just alludes to the fact that idolatry is just a futile quest. You're never going to be happy. You're never going to find peace. You're never going to find contentment with idolatry or idols. In verse 8, they misuse God's blessings. In verse 9, this was a very interesting verse. Lots of commentary on this verse. So, therefore, I'm going to take my grain take it away and take my wine back, and I'm going to take my wool back and my linen back. Does God change his mind? I think God changes, Pat Wiley opinion, I think God changes his mind. He does not change his character. I think he changes his mind based on our actions. You can read numerous commentaries on this one verse and find people that agree with me and people that totally disagree with me, and that's great. It is an interesting verse. Verse 10 talks about her lovers, again being the idols. Verse 11, we're going to take away, God's going to take away the feast and the festivals that he had set up. So this is a prophecy about the siege and the captivity, because they didn't have any feast during the siege. I mean, they barely had food, and sometimes they didn't. And the word her yearly feast and her new moons and her Sabbaths, that means that it's talking about Israel's. So there's a thought that maybe at this point the feasts didn't have anything to do with God. They weren't God's feasts. They were Israel's feast, and maybe that's why God stopped them, because they were not his feast. In verse 12, it talks about them paying with the vine and the trees, and this is different in that sometimes God takes away the fruit, the grapes, the figs, but this time he's taking away the whole vine and the whole fig tree, the whole thing. And her pay in this verse, in verse 12, which she said were her pay, which Israel said, we deserve these, this is our pay. Well, that word pay in Hebrew is a word that means payment for a whore. So they kind of knew what they were doing. And the things that had been a source of wealth and beauty for years were becoming a thing of fear. I'll make them a thicket with wild animals to devour them. Verse 13 talks about the punishment for idolatry. Verse 14 through 23 of this chapter talks about the Lord's restoration of Israel. So it starts out in that day. I'm sorry, that's verse 16. But all of this is kind of in that day. So he's going to woo Israel back. And verse 15 mentions this. I will make the Valley of Achor a door of hope. Valley of Achor was where, right after Jericho, the Israelites think, oh, we're great, and we can do anything, and the Lord is with us, except during the Battle of Jericho, Achan had taken the spoils, and he wasn't supposed to. God had said, no, you're not taking anything. But Achan had, and he hid them, and because of that, at the Valley of Achor, Israel was defeated. And this is all in Joshua 7, if you want to read that story. It's a good story. But he's saying that instead of a door of bad things happening, it's a door of hope. This place is going to be a door of hope. And in verses 16 through 18, he's talking about a personal relationship with a personal relationship with a husband, a loving relationship, not a master submission relationship, but a team relationship, a relationship of love. And verse 17, I will remove the name of the Baals from their lips, and no longer will their names be invoked. I thought this was interesting. In AD 389, all of the ancient Roman temples were closed. So you don't hear of anybody worshiping Baal anymore. And that pretty much just says that, again, another prophecy has happened. Verse 18 talks about the new covenant with Jesus, the new covenant of Jesus. Verses 19 through 20 talks about the new covenant having rightness, justice, love, mercy, and faithfulness. And they will acknowledge Jehovah. There will be no more infidelity. So this new covenant, rightness, justice, love, mercy, and faithfulness really rings of New Testament, new covenant with Jesus. Verses 21 through 23. Verse 21, in that day I will respond, and I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond. That word respond, other versions use hear, and some use answer. So it's an active word, and the Lord is going to respond and take care of this. And all of these things, the skies, the earth, will respond to Jezreel. Now, Jezreel, if you'll remember from day one, means to scatter. The first child, the only child that we know for sure was Hosea's, was named Jezreel. And Jezreel means to scatter, but it also means to sow. And it is a kind of a name that's off of Israel. So there is thought that possibly Jezreel will be the new name for Israel in the second coming. It means to sow and everywhere. So that was interesting. And in verse 23, verse 23 was actually quoted in Romans 9 as a testimony to Hosea's prophecy coming true. You can pause me now and finish this tomorrow. We're going to do chapter 3, but it's a short chapter. So if you want to hang on and do more today, pause me again and read chapter 3. Or you can just stop me and pick me up tomorrow. Okay, in chapter 3, Hosea and Gomer had divorced. The word again in this chapter probably means that they were legally divorced. She was loved by another. And basically this Gomer being loved by another was she was enjoying the lifestyle of another. She, whatever that lifestyle was, she was digging it. And this means, Israel, they were enjoying their status of being vassals to other nations. Verse 2, the raisin cakes. The raisin cakes were used to pay priestesses in pagan shrines, the prostitutes. The raisin cakes were used. And the 15, so Hosea buys Gomer back, and he pays 30 pieces of silver. He pays 15 shekels, which is equal to 30 pieces of silver, which is about the value of a servant, which, oh, by the way, 30 pieces of silver was the value of the blood of Christ, where we were bought out of slavery, just like Gomer was. The other thing of note here was there was also some barley involved in this transaction, and barley was not a good human food. It was used for animals. So it's likening her to the lowest of prostitutes, just almost animal-like. In verse 3, he says he brings Gomer back. Hosea brings Gomer back, and he's this verse that he wait for or abide with me. So she didn't live with him. Some of the commentators, she was not taken home, but she was under contract to prove, so that she could prove that she would stay faithful. And this is a possible prophecy of the pre-Christ centuries, the centuries between the Old and the New Testament. And verse 4 is definitely those. But it's also the time when they were in captivity, because there was no worship. When they were in captivity, they couldn't worship God, but they didn't worship anybody else either. There was just no worship. It was just nothing. And in verse 5 of chapter 3, it is definitely the prophecy about the Messiah. So we'll pick up with chapter 4 tomorrow.